She was a single mom living on the streets, until a stranger changed her life forever. The night was cruel, the rain relentless as it poured from the sky in thick, icy sheets. Claire pulled the tattered blanket tighter around Ethan, shielding his small body from the cold as she crouched beneath the awning of a closed bakery. Her fingers, stiff from the chill, gently stroked his damp hair, her heart aching as she felt him shiver against her. His tiny arms clung to her, seeking warmth, seeking comfort she could barely provide. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, her lips trembling against his cold skin. Her eyes darted around the empty streets, searching for a place, any place that could offer them shelter for the night. The city was asleep, windows dark, doors locked. Even the alleys, usually buzzing with life, were empty, as if the entire world had abandoned them. The cardboard box she had found earlier had been ruined by the rain, leaving them exposed. She adjusted Ethan in her arms, his weight lighter than it should have been. Hunger had stolen the roundness from his cheeks, and the guilt gnawed at her. For a moment, she let herself drift into memories, ones that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. There was a time when she had a home, a warm bed, and laughter filling the rooms. Her husband had been her rock, or so she had believed until the day he walked away. She had been 7 months pregnant, begging him to stay, but his heart had already left long before his feet did. His cruel words still echoed in her mind, a ghost she could never escape. She had fought, holding on to hope, believing she could manage on her own. But hope had faded under the weight of unpaid bills and endless rejection. Landlords turned her away. Employers sighed when they saw Ethan in her arms. A single mother with nothing, no savings, no support, became invisible to the world. Now, she searched through trash bins for scraps, ignored the disgusted looks from strangers, and turned every street corner into a battlefield. She told Ethan they were on an adventure, making a game out of finding food and shelter. But even at 4 years old, he was beginning to understand the truth. She saw it in his eyes when his stomach growled, in the way he barely asked for things anymore, as if he had already learned that wanting was pointless. She clenched her jaw, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. There was no time for weakness. Ethan needed her to be strong. She held him closer, whispering a lullaby against his ear, hoping to lull him into sleep despite the rumbling of his empty stomach. The night stretched on, each passing hour colder than the last. Desperation pushed her to a small convenience store at the corner of the street. The bright lights inside felt like another world, one where people bought food without hesitation, where warmth was a given, not a privilege. She hesitated at the entrance, the warmth seeping through the door tantalizing. She stepped inside, cautiously, Ethan still wrapped in her arms. The smell of fresh bread and hot coffee made her stomach twist painfully. She wasn't here to steal, only to rest for a moment, to let Ethan feel warmth before they braved the cold again. But the store owner's glare met her the second she stepped through the door. His lip curled in disgust as he stepped forward, his voice sharp and cutting. "You again? I told you not to come back." Claire flinched. "Please, we just—" "Out." His voice left no room for argument. Claire's throat tightened as she held Ethan closer. The humiliation burned deep, but there was no fight left in her. Without a word, she turned and stepped back into the rain. The door slammed shut behind her, and the cold swallowed them once more. She leaned against the wall of the store, her body shaking, not just from the cold, but from the weight of it all. The hopelessness, the cruelty of a world that refused to see them. Ethan stirred in her arms, his sleepy eyes peering up at her. His tiny fingers touched her cheek, wiping away the tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "We'll be okay, Mommy," he whispered, his voice filled with an innocence that shattered her. She bit her lip, forcing a smile. "Of course we will, baby." But for the first time, she wasn't sure she believed it. Just as she was about to sink further into despair, a sleek black car slowed to a stop a few feet away. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain as the engine idled. Claire stiffened, her heart hammering. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the night. His gaze locked onto her, unreadable yet intense. Claire froze, clutching Ethan tighter. Could this be the help she desperately needed? Or just another cruel twist of fate? The rain continued to fall, soaking through Claire's thin clothes as she stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. The man took a slow step toward her, his polished shoes splashing against the wet pavement. He was tall, his expensive suit untouched by the storm, his presence commanding yet unreadable. Claire's instinct screamed at her to run, to clutch Ethan and disappear into the shadows. But where would she go? There was no place left to hide. The man's gaze flickered to Ethan, his sharp expression softening for just a moment before returning to its unreadable state. He pulled something from his pocket, a sleek wallet, and flipped it open. "Are you in need of help?" His voice was deep, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something Claire couldn't quite place. She hesitated. People didn't stop for women like her. They walked past, looked away, pretended she didn't exist. And those who did stop, she had learned the hard way, often expected something in return. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "We just need shelter for the night." The man studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. The silence stretched between them, the rain the only sound filling the space. Then he sighed, pulling off his coat. Before Claire could react, he stepped forward and draped the heavy fabric over her shoulders. Claire's breath hitched. The warmth of the coat wrapped around her instantly, the scent of expensive cologne lingering on the fabric. It had been so long since she had felt warmth that she nearly sank into it. "Get in the car," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Claire's grip on Ethan tightened. "What?" He exhaled, as if debating whether to explain himself. "Because I don't like seeing children suffer." The words were simple, but there was something behind them, something that made Claire believe he wasn't lying. She looked down at Ethan, his tiny face pale, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. If she refused, they would spend another night in the cold. And she wasn't sure Ethan could take another night like this. Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then, before fear could change her mind, she stepped forward and into the unknown. The car's interior was warm, too warm. Claire sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, her hands curled around Ethan's tiny frame as he rested against her. The heat from the vents thawed her frozen skin, but she couldn't relax. Her muscles remained tight, her mind racing. What had she just done? She had stepped into a stranger's car, accepted his help without knowing what he truly wanted. Across from her, Nicholas Sinclair sat with one hand on the wheel, his other elbow resting against the door as he watched the road ahead. He had barely spoken since they left the streets, yet his presence filled the space. He didn't look at her, didn't ask questions. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Ethan stirred slightly in her arms, his little fingers tightening on her sleeve. She glanced down, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His breathing was even peaceful. The warmth of the car was already working on him, lulling him into much-needed rest. The car slowed as they pulled into an underground parking lot. Claire's stomach twisted as Nicholas drove into a private section, stopping in front of a reserved elevator. "We're here," he said, turning off the engine. Claire hesitated, staring at the elevator doors. Everything about this screamed danger. This was the kind of place where people like her didn't belong. But Ethan, he needed a warm bed. He needed food. She swallowed her fear and stepped out, holding Ethan close as she followed Nicholas into the elevator. The ride was silent. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway that looked like something out of a magazine. The floors gleamed. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, and at the end of the hall stood a massive double door. Nicholas stepped forward, pulling out a key card and swiping it against the panel. Claire barely had time to take a breath before the doors swung open. Warmth flooded her senses. A golden glow from soft lighting, the scent of fresh linen, the faint hum of classical music playing in the background. She stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. It was a home. No, not a home. A palace. Every inch of the place screamed wealth. The high ceilings, the modern furniture, the massive windows overlooking the city skyline. She had spent so long surviving in the cold, in the filth that this felt unreal. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her face kind and lined with age. "Mr. Sinclair," she greeted warmly, her gaze shifting to Claire and Ethan with curiosity. Nicholas nodded toward Claire. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is Claire and her son, Ethan. They'll be staying here for now." Claire stiffened. "Staying here?" Mrs. Jenkins' face softened. "Come, dear. Let's get you settled." Claire hesitated, looking between Nicholas and the older woman. Nicholas must have noticed her hesitation because he sighed. "You don't have to trust me, Claire. Just let Ethan sleep somewhere warm tonight." She turned to Ethan, who had barely moved in her arms, his tiny face relaxed against her shoulder. He needed this. She nodded slowly. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, gently guiding her toward a hallway. "Come with me, dear. I'll show you to your room." Claire followed, her heart pounding. This felt too good to be true, and in her experience, things that felt too good never lasted. Claire stepped carefully into the guest room, her breath catching at the sheer size of it. The bed was enormous, covered in crisp white sheets that looked untouched. A soft glow from a bedside lamp cast the room in warmth, making the entire space feel unreal. For years, she had slept on hard concrete, in alleyways, and in shelters packed with strangers. Now, she was standing in a room that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. Mrs. Jenkins smiled as she gestured toward the bed. "You can lay him down here, dear. He'll sleep much better." Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her to stay alert, to not let her guard down, but Ethan barely stirred in her arms. His small body had gone limp with exhaustion, his breathing slow and steady. Carefully, she lowered him onto the bed, pulling the soft blanket over him. She smoothed his hair back, her fingers lingering for a moment before stepping away. "You must be hungry," Mrs. Jenkins said kindly. "Come, let's get you something warm to eat." Claire hesitated again, glancing toward the door. Nicholas hadn't followed them in, but his presence lingered in her mind. What did he expect in return for all this? Still, hunger clawed at her stomach, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She followed Mrs. Jenkins back down the hall and into the kitchen, a massive, modern space with stainless steel appliances and marble countertops. A steaming bowl of soup sat waiting on the island, along with a plate of bread. "Go on," Mrs. Jenkins urged. "Eat." Claire sat down cautiously, eyeing the food like it might disappear if she looked away. Then, slowly, she picked up the spoon. The first sip nearly broke her. The warmth spread through her, filling every empty space inside her chest. She hadn't had a real meal in so long. Her eyes burned as she forced herself to eat slowly, though her body screamed for her to devour every last bite. Mrs. Jenkins watched her with a sad smile. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Claire swallowed, gripping the spoon tightly. "I'm not used to people helping without wanting something in return." Mrs. Jenkins' smile didn't fade. "Not everyone in this world is cruel, dear." Claire wasn't sure she believed that. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Nicholas entered the kitchen, his presence filling the space instantly. He was still dressed in his expensive suit, his sharp gaze settling on her. For a moment, Claire's body went rigid. Nicholas sighed, leaning against the counter. "Relax. You look like you expect me to throw you back on the streets." Claire forced herself to meet his gaze. "Why are you doing this?" His expression didn't change. "Because I can." That answer unsettled her more than anything. She set her spoon down, gripping her hands together. "I don't trust you." Nicholas smirked, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "I wouldn't expect you to." Silence stretched between them. Then, before Claire could say anything else, a small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy." Claire turned sharply to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his small fists rubbing at his sleepy eyes. Her heart clenched. Nicholas didn't move, his gaze shifting to the boy. Ethan looked up at him, blinking slowly. Then, without hesitation, he took a step forward. "Thank you for helping us." Nicholas' brows lifted slightly, as if the words caught him off guard. Then slowly he nodded. Claire's throat tightened as she watched the exchange. Ethan trusted too easily. He didn't know the dangers of the world, didn't understand that people weren't kind without a reason. But in that moment, Watching Nicholas kneel down to meet Ethan's height, she saw something in his expression, something that almost looked like understanding. And for the first time since stepping into this home, Claire felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Hope. Claire sat across from Nicholas in his sleek office, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The towering glass windows behind him revealed the city skyline, stretching far beyond what she could ever imagine reaching. The polished desk between them felt like a barrier she had no right to cross. Yet here she was, seated in front of one of the most powerful men she had ever met, waiting for words she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, studying her with a quiet intensity. "I have a proposition for you." Her stomach twisted. Propositions rarely ended well for people like her. "You need stability," he continued. "A way to provide for Ethan, a future beyond surviving day to day." Claire swallowed, her voice small. "I don't have a degree. I don't have experience. You're smart. You learn fast." She let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You don't even know me." Nicholas's expression remained unreadable. "I know enough." The weight of his words settled over her, pressing against every insecurity she had carried for years. She had spent so long believing she wasn't good enough, that she wasn't capable of anything beyond struggling to get by. But now, someone, a man she barely knew, was telling her otherwise. Nicholas slid a contract across the desk. "I want you to work for me. My personal assistant quit last month, and I need someone I can rely on." Claire stared at the paper, her pulse pounding. It felt too good to be true, and she knew better than to trust in miracles. Nicholas seemed to sense her hesitation. "You'll be paid well. You and Ethan will have a home, security. I'm not offering charity, Claire. I'm offering you a chance to rebuild." Her hands clenched in her lap. "And what if I fail?" Nicholas leaned forward, his voice steady. "Then you'll get back up and try again." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. She had spent so many years being knocked down, convinced that failure was permanent, that once she lost everything, there was no way to climb back up. But what if she was wrong? What if she could fight for something better? Slowly, hesitantly, Claire reached for the contract. It was terrifying, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Claire held the contract in her trembling hands long after Nicholas had left the office. The weight of the decision pressed on her chest like a boulder. She had never been given an opportunity like this before, one that could change not just her life, but Ethan's. And yet, fear gripped her like an iron chain. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she made mistakes and Nicholas regretted hiring her? The thought of failing terrified her more than anything. That night, as she sat beside Ethan's bed in the massive guest room Nicholas had provided, she watched his peaceful face as he slept. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his breath soft and steady. He finally had a warm bed, real meals, a sense of security. She couldn't afford to let her fear hold her back anymore. The next morning, Claire walked into Nicholas's office with her heart pounding in her chest. He glanced up from his desk, waiting for her response. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A hint of approval flickered in Nicholas's eyes. "Good," he said simply. But taking the job was just the beginning. From the moment she stepped into the corporate world, Claire felt like she was drowning. She had never worked in an office before, never answered business calls, or scheduled meetings for a CEO. The sleek, modern building felt suffocating, its glass walls and polished floors foreign to her. She sat at her new desk, staring at the overwhelming list of tasks Nicholas had assigned her, feeling like an imposter. The first few days were a nightmare. She accidentally sent the wrong file to an important client, mixed up Nicholas's schedule, and nearly spilled coffee on his desk when her hand shook too much. She braced herself for the inevitable disappointment in Nicholas's eyes, but it never came. Instead, he remained patient, guiding her through her mistakes without a hint of frustration. "You're learning," he told her one evening after she apologized for another blunder. She didn't understand why he wasn't angry. People had always given up on her the moment she made a mistake. But Nicholas didn't. And slowly, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. As the days turned into weeks, Claire started to gain confidence. She memorized Nicholas's schedule, learned the ins and outs of the business, and even started anticipating his needs before he asked. The employees who once looked at her with skepticism began treating her with respect. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a failure. She felt like she belonged. And Ethan, sweet, innocent Ethan, was finally getting the childhood he deserved. Claire walked him to school every morning, his tiny hand gripping hers as he babbled excitedly about his new friends. He had a backpack now, one he proudly wore, and he had teachers who encouraged him, classmates who laughed with him. Seeing him thrive filled Claire with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long just surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. And then, just when she thought things were finally falling into place, her past came crashing back. Claire had just finished organizing Nicholas's calendar when a voice she hadn't heard in years sent ice through her veins. "Well, look at you." She froze. Slowly, she turned, her breath catching in her throat. Jake, the man she once loved. The man who abandoned her when she needed him most. He stood in the middle of the office, looking nothing like the confident, arrogant man she remembered. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt. But his smirk, cold and condescending, hadn't changed. Her stomach churned. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, filled with the anger and hurt she had buried for years. Jake took a slow step closer. "I came to see my son." Her heart pounded violently. "No," she said immediately. He let out a humorless laugh. "He's my son too, Claire. You lost the right to call him that the moment you walked away." Jake's eyes darkened. "I have rights, Claire. Legally, we're still married. And that means I can take Ethan whenever I want." Her blood turned cold. Panic clawed at her throat. "No," she whispered. Jake leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You can't keep him from me forever." Terror gripped Claire as she watched Jake walk away, his threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Everything she had built, everything she had fought for, it could all be taken away in an instant. She wouldn't let it happen. She couldn't. But as fear settled deep in her bones, one terrifying thought consumed her. How far would Jake go to take Ethan away? Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her desk, trying to steady her racing heart. Jake's words echoed her mind, each one a dagger, slicing through her fragile sense of safety. She had come so far, rebuilt a life for herself and Ethan, and yet, in a single moment, it felt like everything was slipping away. She couldn't let fear consume her. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to think rationally. Jake was manipulative, but he was also desperate. She had seen it in his eyes, the bitterness, the hunger for control. He wasn't here out of love for Ethan. He was here because he had lost everything and saw them as an easy target. She needed to protect her son. That evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, she watched his small face relax into sleep, completely unaware of the storm raging around them. She had fought too hard to give him this peace. She wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The next morning, she walked into Nicholas's office with her head held high, determined to ask for help. But before she could say a word, Nicholas spoke first. "I saw him," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire's breath hitched. "I saw the way he looked at you, Claire, and I didn't like it." She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. "He said he has rights, that I can't keep Ethan from him." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "He abandoned you," he said flatly. "That man has no right to anything." Tears burned at the back of Claire's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Nicholas's next words, however, shattered her resolve. "If you want, I can make sure he never comes near you again." She looked up, startled by the quiet intensity in his voice. There was something dangerous in his eyes, something she had never seen before. For the first time since Jake reappeared, she felt something other than fear. She felt protected. But she also knew Nicholas wasn't the kind of man who made empty promises. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Nicholas exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. "Let me handle it." Claire hesitated. Could she trust him? Would he really go that far for her and Ethan? And if he did, what would it cost her? She had spent so much of her life believing that kindness always came with a price. But when she met Nicholas's gaze, there was no demand, no expectation. Just a quiet promise. She had spent years surviving alone. Maybe, just this once, she didn't have to fight alone. With a small nod, she whispered, "Okay." And as Nicholas picked up his phone, making a call that would change everything, Claire realized something. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back, and she wasn't doing it alone. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers tightly clasped together, her knuckles white. The air between her and Nicholas felt heavy, charged with something unspoken yet undeniable. She had spent years burying her past, pretending that the scars Jake had left behind were only skin deep. But the truth was they ran deeper than she had ever admitted, to herself, to anyone. And now, she couldn't hide anymore. Nicholas watched her carefully, his sharp gaze softened by concern. He didn't push, didn't demand answers. He simply waited, as if he already knew that whatever she was about to say would change everything. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her a slight nod, encouraging her to go on. Taking a shaky breath, she finally let the words spill out. Jake wasn't just neglectful. He was cruel. Her voice trembled, but she refused to let it falter. At first, it was just words. "He made me feel small, like I was worthless, like I could never be anything without him." And I believed him. Nicholas's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But he said nothing, letting her continue. But then it got worse, she admitted, her heart pounding in her chest. The drinking, the anger, the way he would lash out when things didn't go his way. "I spent years walking on eggshells, trying to keep him from exploding. And when I got pregnant, I thought maybe he would change. I thought having a child would soften him, make him see that we were worth something." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I was so wrong." Nicholas's breathing was slow and controlled, but Claire could see the tension in his body, the quiet fury he was trying to keep at bay. "Did he hurt you?" His voice was low, dangerous. Claire hesitated before nodding. "There were nights when I thought he would kill me." Nicholas exhaled sharply, standing up abruptly and pacing the room. He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to control the storm of emotions rising within him. "I should have left sooner," Claire admitted, shame creeping into her voice. "But I was scared. I had nothing, nowhere to go. And when he finally walked out on me, I thought maybe it was a blessing. I thought I was finally free." Nicholas turned to face her, his expression dark. "And now he's back," he said, his voice like steel. Claire nodded. His eyes flashed with something dangerous, something fierce. "He's not going to hurt you again." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down Claire's spine. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel helpless. She felt protected. And yet, deep down, she knew Jake wasn't done with her yet. Days passed, but the uneasy feeling in Claire's chest never faded. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. At first, she thought it was just paranoia, a side effect of reopening old wounds. But then, little things started happening. A shadow lingering outside the building. A familiar silhouette across the street. A phone call in the middle of the night. No voice, just heavy breathing before the line went dead. Jake was watching her. The realization sent a chill down her spine. No matter how much distance she had put between them, no matter how much she had tried to rebuild, he was still there, waiting in the darkness. She tried to ignore it, tried to push through the fear. But every time she dropped Ethan off at school, every time she stepped into Nicholas's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was just around the corner, waiting to strike. Nicholas noticed the change in her almost immediately. "You're distracted," he observed one afternoon as she sat across from him in his office. "You're afraid." Claire forced a small smile, shaking her head. "I'm fine." Nicholas leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "Don't lie to me." Her throat tightened. She didn't want to burden him with this. He had already done so much for her, given her a chance when no one else would. But the weight of fear pressing down on her was suffocating. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "He's watching me." Nicholas's expression darkened instantly. "Jake?" She nodded. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind already working through solutions. "Have you seen him? Has he approached you?" No, but I know he's there. I keep getting these calls, and I see him just standing there like he's waiting for something. Nicholas's fists clenched at his sides. That bastard isn't going to lay a finger on you or Ethan. I'll make sure of it. A part of Claire wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel safe, to trust that Nicholas could protect them. But she knew Jake. She knew what he was capable of. And she knew that if he wanted something, he wouldn't stop until he got it. And this time, he wanted Ethan. Her son. Her entire world. The fear clawed at her chest, suffocating her. She had to do something, even if it meant running. Claire lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. She had been here before, cornered, helpless, desperate to escape. And back then, she had run. It was the only way she had survived. But now things were different. Ethan had a home, a real home. He had friends, a school he loved. He had a life that she had fought so hard to give him. Running would mean tearing all of that away. It would mean going back to cold nights on the street, living in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. But what other choice did she have? Jake wouldn't stop. He had made that clear. And if she stayed, he could take Ethan away. He had the legal right. She was still his wife. No matter how terrible he had been, no matter how much he had neglected them, the law didn't always see things the way they truly were. She turned her head, watching Ethan as he slept beside her. His small chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful and untroubled. He trusted her to protect him. He believed in her. Tears burned her eyes. She had to make a decision. By morning, the weight of it all had settled deep in her bones. She packed a small bag for Ethan, stuffing in the essentials, her heart breaking with every piece of his life she had to leave behind. She had to move fast. If Jake was watching, she couldn't give him time to stop her. With one last glance at the home Nicholas had given them, she gripped Ethan's hand and stepped out the door. She barely made it 10 steps before Nicholas was standing in front of her, blocking her path. "Where are you going?" His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Claire's fingers tightened around Ethan's hand. "We have to leave." Nicholas's jaw tensed. "No, you don't. You don't understand, Nicholas. Jake won't stop until he takes Ethan from me. I can't let that happen." "And running is your solution?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Claire, you've been running your whole life. And where has it gotten you?" Her throat tightened. "It kept us safe." "Did it?" Nicholas's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. Or did it just delay the fight you knew you'd eventually have to face?" Claire felt her resolve wavering. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to stand her ground. But the fear was too strong. Nicholas sighed, running a hand through his hair before looking her straight in the eyes. "I know you don't trust easily, but you're not alone this time. You have me. You have people who care about you. Let me help you fight him." Claire's lip trembled as she swallowed hard. "What if we lose?" Nicholas reached out, his hand warm and steady as it rested on her shoulder. "Then we fight harder." A tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was crying out of fear or something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And hope was something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and quiet determination. Claire no longer flinched at every shadow, no longer planned an escape at the first sign of trouble. Instead, she focused on what needed to be done. With Nicholas by her side, she met with a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, who took one look at Claire's worried face and declared, "We're going to make sure you never have to run again." The legal battle was more complicated than Claire had anticipated. Jake had rights, no matter how undeserving he was. The fact that she had been homeless worked against her. The courts would question her ability to provide stability, even though she had fought with everything she had to survive. "He's going to use that against me," Claire whispered after their first meeting with Evelyn. "He'll make me look like a failure." Nicholas shook his head. "No, he won't. You're not a failure, Claire. You're the strongest person I know." She wished she could believe him. Then, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment to test her, Jake made his next move. It started with an envelope slipped under her door. Inside were court papers. Jake was officially filing for custody. Claire's hand shook as she read through the cold, legal words. He was claiming she had been an unfit mother, that she had put Ethan in dangerous situations, that she had exposed him to instability and hardship. And worst of all, he had hired a lawyer skilled in twisting the truth. "He's trying to take him," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Nicholas took the papers from her hands, his eyes scanning the words. When he finally looked at her, his expression was unreadable. "He won't win," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. Claire wanted to believe that. But as the reality of the fight ahead settled in, fear clawed at her chest. Could she really do this? Was she strong enough to stand in a courtroom and relive the worst moments of her life? Would the law see her pain? Or would it only see her mistakes? Nicholas must have seen the doubt in her eyes because he reached for her hands, his grip strong, grounding her. "Claire, listen to me," he said. "You're not alone in this. You never have to be alone again." For the first time in her life, Claire let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight this battle alone. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the final documents. Claire held her breath, her fingers clenched tightly together on her lap. The air was thick with tension, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the words being spoken. Beside her, Nicholas sat still, his presence a quiet source of strength. But even he couldn't stop the storm of emotions raging inside her. Jake sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Throughout the entire trial, he had fought viciously, painting Claire as an unstable mother, someone incapable of providing a secure home for Ethan. His lawyer had twisted every part of her past, using her homelessness as a weapon against her, as if it were proof of her failure. But Claire had fought back. She had told her story, the real one. She had stood before the court, voice trembling but firm, and spoken about the nights spent in shelters, the sacrifices she had made to keep Ethan safe, the way she had clawed her way out of despair and built a new life. She had spoken the truth, and now all she could do was wait. When the judge finally lifted his eyes, Claire felt her whole world teetering on the edge of a cliff. "In the matter of custody," the judge said, his voice steady, "I find that the petitioner, Jake Turner, has failed to demonstrate the ability to provide a safe and stable environment for the child in question. Furthermore, due to past incidents of neglect and abuse, the court declares him unfit as a custodial parent." Claire's breath hitched. "The sole custody of Ethan Turner is granted to his mother, Claire Turner." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, washing away years of fear and uncertainty. She gasped, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She had won. She had truly won. Jake's expression twisted into something ugly, his hands clenching into fists. He opened his mouth to argue, but the judge had already turned to his lawyer, dismissing any further debate. It was over. Claire barely noticed the rest of the proceedings. All she could think about was Ethan, her sweet, innocent son who would never again have to fear being taken away. She turned to Nicholas, who was already looking at her, his eyes filled with something that looked like pride. "You did it," he whispered. Claire let out a shaky laugh, wiping away her tears. "We did it." As they walked out of the courtroom, the weight that had sat on Claire's shoulders for years finally lifted. For the first time in forever, she felt free. Claire stepped out of the courtroom, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The weight of the verdict had settled in, but it still felt surreal. She had won. After years of fear, after every moment of doubt, after all the nights spent awake, terrified of losing Ethan, she had won. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The air outside was crisp, and the afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the city. She could hear the distant sounds of traffic, the chatter of strangers passing by, but it all felt muted, as if she were standing in a world separate from everyone else. Nicholas walked beside her, silent but steady. He hadn't said much since they left the courtroom, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. Claire glanced down at her hands, still trembling. She had been strong for so long, fighting battles that never seemed to end, but now that it was over, all the emotions she had kept bottled up threatened to spill over. She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes. "Are you okay?" Nicholas's voice was quiet, careful. Claire let out a soft, breathless laugh. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel right now. Nicholas studied her for a moment before responding. Relieved? Maybe? Proud. Proud. The word felt foreign to her. She had spent so much time doubting herself, believing she wasn't strong enough, that she would fail. But now, as she stood outside the courthouse with a future that was finally her own, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been stronger than she ever gave herself credit for. Claire turned to Nicholas, searching his face. I wouldn't have done this without you. He shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. You did this, Claire. You fought. You won. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. I was so scared, she admitted. Every second in that courtroom, I thought they'd take Ethan away. I thought Jake would find a way to win. But he didn't, Nicholas reminded her. And he never will again. She nodded, her throat tightening. She paused, her voice breaking. I need to see Ethan. Nicholas reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Mrs. Jenkins is with him now. Let's go home. Home. The word filled her with warmth. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was the people who had stood by her, who had fought with her. It was the safety and love she had longed for her entire life. When they arrived at the penthouse, Claire barely had time to open the door before a small figure came rushing toward her. Mom! Ethan's arms wrapped tightly around her waist, his little body shaking. Claire dropped to her knees, holding him as close as she could. She buried her face in his hair, inhaling the familiar scent of his shampoo, feeling his warmth against her. Hey, baby, she whispered. I missed you. Ethan pulled back slightly, his big brown eyes searching hers. Did we win? Claire felt her heart squeeze. She cupped his face gently, nodding. Yes, sweetheart. We won. You're safe. Ethan let out a breath of relief, his tiny hands gripping her arms. He's not going to take me away? Claire shook her head firmly. Never. No one can take you away from me, ever again. Ethan's eyes watered, but he smiled. Good. Claire pulled him close again, holding on as if she'd never let go. She felt Nicholas standing nearby, watching them, but she didn't let go of Ethan for a long time. Mrs. Jenkins wiped her eyes from across the room, offering Claire a warm smile. I knew you would win, dear. You're stronger than you think. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding. Thank you. For everything. Nicholas cleared his throat. How about we celebrate? He gave Ethan a playful look. Ice cream. Ethan grinned. Yes. Claire laughed softly, brushing a hand through Ethan's hair. That sounds perfect. But as she stood up, Nicholas caught her gaze, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. And in that moment, she realized that winning custody of Ethan wasn't just about keeping him safe. It was about stepping into a future she never thought she deserved. And that future was just beginning. Claire sat in the quiet of the penthouse later that evening, staring out at the city lights flickering against the dark sky. The reality of the courtroom victory had settled in, but it still felt surreal. She had spent so many nights terrified that Ethan would be taken from her, that Jake would win somehow, that her past would forever hold her captive. But now, for the first time in years, she was free. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Ethan curled up on the couch with his favorite book. His little body was relaxed, no longer weighed down by the fear that had haunted them both for so long. Claire swallowed against the lump in her throat. He could finally have a childhood untouched by fear. That was all she had ever wanted. A warm presence appeared beside her, and she didn't have to turn to know it was Nicholas. He had been there through everything, steady, unwavering, always knowing when she needed space and when she needed someone to lean on. How does it feel? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. She exhaled slowly. Strange. Nicholas arched an eyebrow. Strange. Claire glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. For years, I was always running, always afraid. It feels strange to know I don't have to do that anymore. Nicholas studied her for a long moment. You don't have to be afraid ever again, Claire. He's gone. He can't hurt you or Ethan. She nodded, but deep inside, there was still a lingering fear, an echo of the past she couldn't silence. It's just hard to believe, she admitted, that it's really over. Nicholas's gaze softened. It is. The certainty in his voice sent warmth through her chest. He believed in her, in this new chapter of her life, even when she still had trouble believing it herself. As if sensing the heaviness in the air, Ethan suddenly looked up from the couch. "Mom, can we get ice cream now?" Claire laughed, shaking her head at his impeccable timing. "You never forget, do you?" Ethan grinned. "No." Nicholas stood up, offering Claire his hand. "Come on, let's celebrate." The ice cream shop was nestled in a quiet corner of the city, a small place that felt homey and warm. It was a rare sight to see Nicholas Whitmore, the ruthless billionaire, in such a casual setting, but here he was, standing in line with Ethan, both of them debating between chocolate chip and cookie dough. Claire watched them from a nearby booth, her heart swelling at the sight. Nicholas had stepped into her and Ethan's life so unexpectedly, yet now she couldn't imagine a world without him in it. "You're staring," Nicholas said, sliding into the seat across from her with a smirk. Claire rolled her eyes, accepting the ice cream he placed in front of her. "Just wondering how a man like you knows about little ice cream shops like this." Nicholas took a bite of his ice cream, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I used to come here." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You?" He nodded, his gaze flickering to the window, as if he were looking at a memory only he could see. "When I was a kid, my mother used to bring me here." It was the only time she really slowed down. Claire's heart clenched. Nicholas had never spoken much about his family, but there was something about the way he said it that made her realize he had his own ghosts, his own scars. "You don't talk about her much," she said carefully. Nicholas shrugged. "Not much to talk about." But Claire knew better. He had been raised in wealth, in a world of power and business, but it had been a lonely one. She could see it now, in the way he always put others before himself, in the way he had protected her and Ethan so fiercely. He had spent his whole life taking care of everyone else. But who had taken care of him? Before she could say anything else, Ethan spoke up. "Mr. Nicholas, do you have a family?" Nicholas hesitated for a brief moment, then smiled down at Ethan. "I have you and your mom, don't I?" Claire's breath caught, her chest tightening at the weight of those words. He said it so casually, yet it meant everything. Ethan beamed. "Yeah, you're like kind of my family now." Nicholas chuckled. "I suppose I am." Claire felt something shift inside her. Nicholas had been a protector, a mentor, a friend, but he was becoming something more. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Claire found herself rebuilding a life she never thought she could have. Her temporary job at Nicholas's company turned into a full-time position, and for the first time, she had stability. She wasn't just surviving, she was growing. She enrolled in business courses, pushing herself to learn, to prove that she was capable of more than just making it through each day. Nicholas noticed. She often caught him watching her with a quiet sort of pride, as if he had known all along that she was capable of more than she ever believed. One evening, as she finished up some paperwork at the office, Nicholas leaned against the doorway of her small office. "You know, you're impressive," he said casually. Claire smirked. "Is it your way of giving me a compliment?" Nicholas chuckled. "Take it or leave it." She shook her head, setting down her pen. "Honestly, I never thought I'd get here. A year ago, I was sleeping in my car with Ethan, wondering if I'd even make it to the next day. Now I have a job, a home, a future." Nicholas stepped closer, his expression serious. "That's because of you, Claire. You fought for this. You built this life for yourself." She swallowed hard. "I had help." He held her gaze. "Maybe, but you're the one who refused to give up." Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she had done this on her own, but deep down, she knew Nicholas had been a part of it. And that terrified her, because if she let herself love him, truly love him, what happened if she lost him too? Nicholas must have sensed the shift in her because he didn't push further. Instead, he simply said, "Come on, let's go home." Home. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was the life she was building. It was the people she was learning to trust. And maybe, just maybe, it was Nicholas too. Claire had always imagined that victory in the courtroom would feel like an explosion of relief, a dramatic moment where she would break down in tears and finally feel the weight of the past lift completely. But as she walked out of the courthouse, Ethan's small hand gripping hers tightly. The feeling was quieter, more like a slow, deep exhale after holding her breath for years. It was over. Jake was gone, declared an unfit father, stripped of any legal right to Ethan. The judge's ruling had been firm, the decision final. She had won. The crisp autumn air wrapped around her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her pulse still racing from the whirlwind of emotions inside the courtroom. Nicholas was beside her, his usual controlled demeanor unshaken, yet there was something different about the way he looked at her. Pride, admiration. "You did it," he said, his voice low but steady. Claire nodded, but her throat was too tight to speak. She glanced down at Ethan, who was skipping slightly, his little face brighter than she had seen in years. He had been scared for so long, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering when Jake would come back to take him away. Now, he didn't have to be afraid anymore. "Mom," Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his voice filled with excitement. "Does this mean we can finally get a dog?" Claire let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "That's what you're thinking about right now." Ethan grinned. "You promised." She had a long time ago, back when she thought life would never settle down enough for promises like that to be kept. Nicholas smirked. "I think he has a point. A victory this big deserves a celebration." Claire glanced at him. "You think a dog is a good idea?" Nicholas shrugged. "He's been through a lot. Maybe having something small and loyal to take care of wouldn't be the worst thing." Ethan gasped. "So we can really get one?" Claire exhaled, a small smile breaking through her disbelief. "I suppose so." Ethan cheered, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Claire felt light. That night, as she sat on her small balcony, the reality of her new life began to settle in. For years, fear had been her shadow, lurking behind every decision, every fleeting moment of peace. But now she had a future to look forward to. The city lights stretched out before her, twinkling against the dark sky, and she felt a strange sense of hope she hadn't dared to embrace before. A soft knock sounded behind her, and she turned to see Nicholas leaning against the doorway. "You look like you're thinking too much," he remarked, stepping onto the balcony. Claire chuckled. "It's a habit." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the city skyline. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Nicholas had been there through everything, never wavering, never asking for anything in return. She wasn't sure how to process what that meant. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to do all this for me and Ethan." Nicholas turned his head, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to." Claire swallowed. "What?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her the way he always did, like she was something more than just a survivor, more than just a woman trying to piece her life together. "Because you deserve a chance to be happy," he said finally. Her heart clenched at his words, and she looked away, afraid of the emotions rising inside her. "Claire," Nicholas's voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "I know you don't trust easily. I know you've been hurt before. But not everyone leaves. Not everyone breaks what they touch." Her breath caught. He saw her. Not just the strong, determined woman she had forced herself to become, but the broken pieces she still struggled to hold together. She wanted to believe him, but love had betrayed her before. The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings. Claire settled into her full-time role at Whitmore Enterprises, no longer just an assistant, but someone Nicholas trusted with real responsibilities. She started business courses in the evenings, determined to carve out a future she could be proud of. And, true to her promise, she and Ethan adopted a small golden retriever puppy, much to his delight. Life was finally moving forward, but something lingered between her and Nicholas. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the way he always made sure she had eaten, the way his hand would linger just a second too long when he brushed past her. He was waiting for her, but she wasn't sure she was ready. Until the night of the gala. The event was one of the biggest of the year, an annual charity gala hosted by Whitmore Enterprises, attended by the city's elite. Claire had been hesitant to go, but Nicholas insisted. "You belong there," he had said simply. So now she stood in the grand ballroom, dressed in an elegant navy gown, feeling entirely out of place among the polished socialites. Nicholas had been busy all evening, mingling, shaking hands, being the businessman the world expected him to be. But every now and then, she caught his gaze across the room, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, suddenly, he was beside her. "Come with me," he murmured. Before she could question it, he led her onto the balcony overlooking the city. The air was crisp, the music from inside muffled by the distance. Claire turned to him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Nicholas, what? I can't keep pretending." He cut her off, his voice raw. Claire froze. "Pretending?" His eyes burned into hers. "That I don't love you." The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Claire's breath hitched, her mind racing. "Nicholas, I know you're scared," he said, stepping closer. "I know you think love means pain, but it doesn't have to. Not with me." Tears burned behind her eyes. "What if I ruin it? What if I lose you too?" Nicholas reached out, gently cupping her face. "You won't." For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something good. And when she leaned into him, letting his warmth surround her, she knew this was home. Claire had spent so many years fearing love, convinced that every person who promised to stay would eventually walk away. But as she stood there on the balcony, Nicholas's hands gently cupping her face, she realized something. He had never left. Through every battle, every dark moment, he had been there. Not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but honesty. Love wasn't supposed to feel this safe, this steady. It was supposed to be reckless, unpredictable. At least, that was what she had been taught. "Nicholas," she whispered, her voice trembling. He waited, his expression unreadable, giving her the space to decide. She had spent so much time convincing herself that happiness wasn't meant for her, that loving someone meant opening herself up to heartbreak. But this wasn't the same. Nicholas wasn't like Jake. He had seen her at her weakest, at her most broken. And still, he was here. A lump formed in her throat as she slowly brought her hands up to rest over his. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Nicholas smiled softly, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You don't have to know everything, Claire. Just let yourself feel it." Her breath caught. For years, she had been fighting for survival, for security, for a future that wasn't dictated by fear. But now, for the first time, she wanted to fight for something else. For love. Before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the distance between them, resting her forehead against his. She felt his steady breath, the warmth of his skin against hers. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," he whispered, "but I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, Claire decided to believe him. The gala continued inside, but Claire and Nicholas stayed on the balcony, caught in a moment that felt too fragile to break. Eventually, he pulled away slightly, his gaze still locked onto hers. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said. Claire's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You were never just my assistant, Claire. From the moment I met you, I knew there was something different about you. Something strong, unbreakable." Claire frowned. "I wasn't strong when you found me." Nicholas shook his head. "Yes, you were. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up. And you've done that over and over again." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I tried to ignore it," Nicholas continued. "Try to convince myself that what I felt was just admiration, respect. But it was always more." His voice softened. "I love you, Claire. And not because you need saving. Not because you're a survivor. I love you because of who you are." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever said those words to her without conditions, without expecting something in return. Nicholas brushed away her tears with his thumb, his touch gentle. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." Claire let out a shaky breath, emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so long running, from love, from pain, from the possibility of happiness. But maybe, just maybe it was time to stop. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you too." Nicholas stilled, as if he hadn't dared to hope for those words. Then, Slowly, a smile broke across his face. And when he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was patient, filled with unspoken promises. For the first time, Claire let herself believe in something more than just survival. She let herself believe in love. A month passed, and life began to settle into something that felt almost normal. Claire still woke up some mornings expecting to feel the weight of fear pressing down on her, but it never came. Instead, she woke up to the sound of Ethan laughing, the soft patting of their new puppy's paws against the floor, and the quiet comfort of knowing she was safe. Her job at Whitmore Enterprises had become more than just work. It was a future. She had been promoted, given more responsibilities, and even encouraged by Nicholas to start working on her own business plans. And then there was him. Nicholas had kept his promise. He had been patient, never pushing her too far, always giving her the space she needed to heal. Their relationship wasn't rushed, wasn't built on fiery passion alone. It was steady, secure. It was love. One evening, as Claire tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes and a mischievous smile. "Mom, she hummed, smoothing his blanket. "Are you and Nicholas going to get married?" Claire nearly choked on air. "What?" Ethan grinned. "You like him. He likes you. Isn't that how it works?" Claire let out a soft laugh, brushing his hair back. "It's not always that simple." "Why not?" She sighed, thinking. "Because love isn't just about liking someone. It's about trust, about being ready." Ethan yawned, snuggling into his pillow. "I think you're ready." Claire's heart clenched. Maybe he was right. A few weeks later, Claire found herself standing in front of a packed ballroom, microphone in hand, staring out at hundreds of faces. She had never imagined she would be here, speaking at a charity event, telling her story not with shame, but with pride. Nicholas stood in the front row, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her feel braver. Taking a deep breath, she began. "I once thought survival was the best I could hope for. That fear would always be a part of my life. That love was something meant for other people. But I was wrong." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "I am more than what I've been through. I am more than my past. And if you're sitting here tonight thinking that you'll never escape the darkness, that you'll never be more than your worst moments, I want you to know that you can." Nicholas's eyes softened as she continued, her voice growing steadier. "I found a family where I never expected one. I found love when I thought I didn't deserve it. And most importantly, I found myself." The room erupted into applause, but Claire barely heard it. She only saw Nicholas. As she stepped down from the stage, he was there, waiting for her. Pride shone in his eyes as he took her hands in his. "You were incredible," he murmured. Claire smiled, feeling lighter than she ever had. "I think I finally believe in happiness." Nicholas squeezed her hands. "Good, because this is just the beginning." And for the first time, Claire truly believed it. This was just the start of something extraordinary. Claire stood by the balcony, gazing at the city lights twinkling like scattered stars. The air was cool, carrying the scent of roses from the gallows garden. But she wasn't thinking about the night or the event. Her mind was on the man standing beside her. Nicholas. She turned to him, seeing the warmth in his eyes, the quiet understanding that had always been there. He had given her more than just protection. He had given her the space to become the woman she was always meant to be. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted softly. "A life that feels whole." Nicholas stepped closer, his fingers brushing against hers. "That's because you fought for it. You never gave up." She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something deeper: gratitude, love, hope. "You once told me I didn't have to run anymore," she whispered. "And you were right." Nicholas cupped her face, his touch gentle yet firm. "Then stay, Claire. Stay with me." The words hung in the air, full of unspoken promises. Claire exhaled shakily, but there was no fear left inside her. Only certainty. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. Nicholas smiled, pulling her into his arms. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other, Claire realized that this moment, this love, was the future she had been waiting for. A new beginning, a life no longer defined by fear, but by love. And for the first time, she was truly free.